in the middle of Seminar 19, Lacan repeatedly draws all four of his formulas of sexuation, too masculine, too feminine, and with no rapport in between. But most of his attention, if you read these chapters carefully, is focused on the upper formulas of the four that he draws, the formulas with those backwards capital E's. The first of which reads, "There exists someone for whom the phallic function is inoperable." Here's the first formula for masculine subjectivity. The E backwards X next to the capital phi X with a line over the top that reads, "There exists someone for whom the phallic function is inoperable." And then you get its antagonism, its confrontation with the other E formula, which reads, "There does not exist someone for whom the phallic function is inoperable." So it's the same formula, except over the EX, we have a line, a bar that negates the "there exists." So the first formula says there does exist someone for whom the phallic function is inoperable, and the second formula, the first for feminine subjectivity, says there does not exist someone for whom the phallic function is inoperable. Now, these serve as obstacles to each other. They are clearly opposed to each other, but their relationship is one of each posing a barrier to the truth value of its opponent. I do, however, believe that one is truer than the other. At stake in this opposition between the two backwards capital EX formulas, Lacan claims, is a certain psychoanalytic insight whose clinical and conceptual import can be best presented, he claims, by way of set theory. Notice how he sets this up on page 119 of our English translation, right at the start of chapter 10. "I have written again on the blackboard the four formulas in which I try to define what makes up for what I have called the impossibility of writing what is involved in the sexual relation. It is to the extent that two terms confront one another in the upper two formulae, one of which is there exists, and the other there does not exist, that I have been trying to make the contribution that might usefully be carried in from set theory. The there exists is the first backwards EX formula, and the there does not exist that he's talking about here is the second. But before we get to all this, before we get back into set theory, because mind you, we've been here before with Lacan, set theory, which I believe is indeed the horizon of these chapters, so we do want to eventually get back to it. But before all that, let's recall what we know about these two backwards EX formulas that Lacan centers most of his attention in these middle chapters of Seminar 19 upon. The first formula is a matter of masculine fantasy. To enjoy as a masculine subject, regardless of what's behind your swimsuit, is to believe that somehow, some way, somewhere, there is someone to whom the phallic function does not apply. Who is this exceptional man? Examples abound. The mythical father of the primal horde who enjoys all the women without limit. Recall this from Seminar 17 forward. This has been a great example of this exceptional man. Add to this strong men of every stripe that Western democratic cultures seem so fascinated by these days, politically, economically, sexually. These are men in our fantasies who enjoy without limit, grabbing everybody in their swimsuit zone, because that's what you're allowed to do when you're a real man. Part and parcel of this masculine fantasy, which is as toxic as they come, but also wonderfully homoerotic if you pay careful attention, is that maybe, somehow, some way, someday, you might become an exceptional man, maybe even the exceptional man, if you just accumulate enough authority, money, cars, houses, horses, hair plugs, facial hair, sideburns, and women. All the signifiers of masculinity are firing here. If you just put one more bumper sticker from another national park on the side of your $200,000 camping van, you will indeed be a real man of the wild. In fantasy, all of this is possible. But in fact, it's just the opposite. Exceptional men to whom the phallic function does not apply, they are impossible. Which is why we often call them real ones. He a real one. You're a real one. Behind the fantastical figure of a real one, a figure that we will indeed radicalize by the end of this lecture, is the fundamental fact that the one in question, this someone who eludes castration, is only ever a name of the real, and in this sense a statement of the impossible. This is the logic that Lacan has been hitting his audience with for the past couple of years now, and I believe it's probably starting to sink in for you as it is for me. When men insist and even exclaim, "There is one," it's the impossible prop of their own existence as men that they are calling out. Make no mistake, the one that props up masculine enjoyment is only ever a real one. And here we start to radicalize the notion that's so often bandied about people being real ones. The real one here is a figure, a digit, a numerical statement of the impossible, of what cannot exist except at the level of the myth, the fantasy, the name, and one name in particular, which we are also radicalizing as best we can, following Lacan's lead, the name of the Father. Here the Father in question is the father of the primordial horde. Yet another reason, I believe, that we should emphasize the number one implicit in Lacan's formula of masculine fantasy. There exists at least one for whom the phallic function is inoperative. That's what that backwards EX says. There exists at least one real man, exceptional man, for whom the phallic function doesn't apply. At stake in chapters 9 and 10 of Seminar 19, which is where we find ourselves, is the status of this number one, the status of this at least one. Which brings us to Lacan's other backwards capital E formula, which directly contests the first. This is the backwards EX with a line over the top, and the capital Phi X with a line over the top that says again, there does not exist someone for whom the phallic function is inapplicable. You don't believe me? Just ask around. Consult your own past experience. Everyone we meet enjoys a little, to a lot, to fucking entirely, according to the phallic function. This doesn't mean that phallic enjoyment is the only way to enjoy. It just means that we have yet to meet anyone whose enjoyment negates it. And I want you to recall this difference between Lacan's formula for feminine enjoyment that says not all of her enjoyment is phallic, versus the claim of a mythical father who negates the phallic function. Women can enjoy in ways different from phallic enjoyment without negating it. The wager of masculine fantasy is that it is indeed possible to negate it. The feminine subject proves that it's possible to enjoy differently without negating the phallic function. And yet the masculine subject wagers everything on the opposite, namely that it's possible to enjoy apart from, by negating the phallic function. That is a key difference here. The other enjoyment that women have access to, and here again I mean feminized subjects, it doesn't matter what's behind your swimsuit, does not come at the expense necessarily of phallic enjoyment. It doesn't negate phallic enjoyment. Unlike the myth of the father of the primal horde, whose enjoyment negates the phallic function and all the enjoyment attached to it. Hold that in mind. It's a very key point that Lacan's making at the end of chapter 8 in seminar 19, which we discussed in our last lecture. But let's get back to our task here. Where masculine subjects fantasize about someone, I think it's safe to say that feminine subjects discover no one. Not at least one person, but 0 people. That's the claim here. Men fantasize that there is at least one person whose enjoyment negates phallic function. Women, however, when they show up, they prove that there are 0 people. There is not at least one. There is not even one who escapes the logic of the phallic function. If the numerical figure of the exceptional man in masculine fantasy is the number 1, what is the numerical figure that women offer in its place? Take a guess. 0. 0 is the numerical figure that Lacan's second backwards EX formula introduces in place of the number 1 that men fantasize about. A 1 that looks a hell of a lot like a vertical pronoun, that looks a hell of a lot like a phallus, that looks a hell of a lot like, you just keep going down that path. The wager here in the second backwards EX formula, the one that says there does not exist a single person whose enjoyment negates the phallic function, says that there is not one person on earth for whom the phallic function is inoperative. Indeed, this population of living subjects for whom the phallic function is inoperative, this population then, now, and evermore is 0. Were we to stitch all of this into a single axiom, a bumper sticker of our own, it would go something like this, I believe. The exceptional man is not outside of masculine fantasy. And I think you can read this or hear this in a couple of different ways. First, it's only within the realm of masculine fantasy that this exceptional man exists. But his existence at this level, in the realm of a masculine imaginarium, is only ever an in-existence, in keeping with a term Lacan is using here in seminar 19 that we've discussed. Because he, this man, is never anything more than a name of the impossible, a pronouncement of what can't be, and as such, a figure of in-existence, because this is a figure of the impossible that exists in the field of the symbolic. It is a name of the real, in very much the same way that we've been discussing it over the past few lecture series. But that's not the only way to read this bumper sticker that says the exceptional man is not outside of masculine fantasy. Here's another way to read it. Outside the realm of masculine fantasy, there is not some one exceptional man, but instead 0 exceptional men. The Father is only ever a not one, specifically a not one, N-A-U-G-H-T one, a zeroed out one, a zero that can only be made to count as one, and only with some serious mathematical help, which is precisely what Lacan aims to offer to this 0 point of masculinity. At issue here, let me try and be clear, because already we got some ones and zeros popping left and right. At issue here, I believe, is a dispute over the status of the mythical father, and the stakes, as we're going to see, are high. This mythical father, this exceptional man whose unlimited, uncastrated, unconstrained enjoyment is thought to negate the phallic function, it is his status that is in question here. Let's ask the question. Is he, this exceptional man, is he the number one man or the 0 point of masculinity, as you heard me just describe him? What is his status? Is he the original, first, foremost, number one man? And don't just think about that chronologically, think about that sociologically, hierarchically. He's the number one man, the number one, first place among men. Is this his status? Or is he, in fact, the 0 point of masculinity? Men wager on the former. To be a masculine subject is to wager on the existence of a number one man and to dream every night about becoming him. Women, however, prove the latter. Women prove that the myth of the father of the primal horde is just that, a myth, and that this myth points to the 0 point of masculinity, a man that cannot and will not exist. Ultimately, though, we're still just kicking around ones and zeros. This has always been what it comes down to for Lacan, and it's been that way with him for as long as we've been reading Lacan. He's been talking more or less about ones and zeros. From cybernetics to the symbolic, to the name of the Father in the original sense, to the fallibility of all things phallic. Lacan remains first and foremost, hear me now, a theorist of digital culture. You want to read Lacan wildly, you want to read him creatively, you want to read him thoroughly, read him as a theorist of digital culture, who is taking his start at the emergence of the third industrial revolution that coincides with the birth of cybernetics, computer science, and the digitization of data, namely its transformation into ones and zeros. Isn't this the basic structure of the symbolic? 1 equals presence, 0 equals absence. In the field of the symbolic, it's all about presence and absence, ones and zeros. The society propped up by the symbolic is a digital society. Consider, for instance, Lacan's first conceptual flourish in chapter 9 of Seminar 19. We're on page 114, 115. It's worth checking out here. He's determined to help us understand the proper relationship between 1 and 0. And again, when he's not drawing on Aristotle, in this seminar he turns to Frege. No exception here. In Frege's logic, the logic that is laid out in the Grundlagen der Arithmetik, you will see at once the insufficiency of any logical deduction of 1, because it has to pass via 0, which cannot be said to be 1. And yet everything unfolds in such a way that the entire arithmetic sequence proceeds from the fact that 1 is missing at the level of 0. Because already, from 0 to 1, that makes 2. From this point forth, it will make 3, because there will be 0, 1, and 2. And so on, right up to the first of the Alephs. Hang on, we'll talk about it. Which, curiously enough, yet not without reason, can only be designated as Aleph, not. Lacan's point, a la Frege here, is that even the most basic series of integers, 1, 2, 3, and so on, in even this most basic count, the starting number is 0. The count begins with 0, not 1. Which means that the number 1 is actually the second number in this sequence. That's what he's saying here, not the first. And that this is just the start, as we're about to see, of what becomes of that number 1. Already Lacan is displacing its original status. It is not the first number in the count, 0 is. The number 1 is in fact the second, and it's only going to get more complicated for the 1 from here. And I think this is partly why Lacan cues up the Aleph. You can look it up. It's a totally, I don't know that he needs the reference here, but it is intriguing for sure. Maybe he's going to do more with it later. The Aleph is the first letter of the Semitic abjads, which is like an ancient form of writing. The ancient Hebrew figure of the Aleph that Cantor, among others, have used in mathematics, it looks like a crazy N, just as mathematicians have carried it forth, right from the Hebrew. But its Phoenician sibling, and this is what I think matters here, it looks more like a sideways capital A. If I were to draw it, you could turn an A on its side and put a slash, a vertical slash through it. So you extend the middle bar and the A out to the sides. This would have been the Phoenician drawing of this Aleph. But check it out. Since the Greeks learned to write by puzzling over Phoenician symbols like this, and that isn't irrelevant here, the basis for writing in the West comes from Greeks puzzling over enigmatic symbols that came cruising by their shores written on the sides of Phoenician ships. And the origin of writing, as scholars have shown, is a bunch of Greeks getting together and winning drinking games and basically engraving trophies with weird little symbols, the meaning of which they knew not, that they saw on the side of Phoenician ships. One of those symbols could have been this. You might choose it to put on the side of your drinking trophy, dear ancient Greek, just because it looks hardcore, just because it looks cool. The origin of writing in the West is mimetic scribbling without any understanding of the meaning that the signifiers are. You know they're signifiers, but you don't know what they mean. Does that sound familiar? It better sound familiar. This is the origin of writing in the West. It also gives us a clue of what Lacan is up to when he's putting writing on his own wall, and especially when he's doing so in discussions of the symptom. My point in queuing this up, following Lacan's lead here, is that ever since the Greeks learned to write by puzzling over weird Phoenician symbols like the one I just showed you, you know what? It should come as no surprise in this that you would find one of these Phoenician symbols at the origin of one of our own symbols. The Phoenician symbol I just showed you of an open-faced triangle with a slash through it, this is the origin of our own capital A, which is also the sign of the big other. And when turned upside down, well, just take a look at Lacan's other formulas of sexuation. We are not out in left field here. We are at the bottom of the pool, picking up what's been dropped. Let me ask you, though, where did the ancients get their Alephs? Again, think at the level of the symptom. They sure as hell were. It goes all the way back to Egyptian hieroglyphs. Here, notably, the glyph of the ox's head. And don't forget, alp was the sound in Western Semitic for the word ox. Does that matter here? You damn straight it matters here, because this is precisely how Lacan introduces the upside-down capital A in Seminar 18. He says, originally, it amounts to the artistic figure of a bull's head. It's at the start of Seminar 18. We discussed it in our couple of series ago when we worked through Seminar 18. Note what is happening here. The origin of that capital A that is now upside down in his formulas of sexuation is a bull's head. Here, maybe it's a bull's head turned on its side in the Phoenician. Lacan is going right back to the Egyptians as well. He's thinking in each of these ways, whether he knows it or not. The important part for us is this. The aleph in question is not a written symbol borrowed from the symbolic. That's not what upside down capital A is. Instead, it's a figure of the real, mobilized for mathematics. So be very careful when you start talking about the transition, as we've been talking, from signifiers to then letters turned upside down and backwards. Because the origin of these upside down and backward letters, it might not be the symbolic, but instead the real, at the level of a real bull's head. Okay, but back to the passage at hand. Up from the bottom of the pool we come. When Lacan ends this riff with aleph not, it's the 0 point, the not point, N-A-U-G-H-T, of the series 1, 2, 3, that he means to mark as original, foundational, and inaugural. I think that's pretty clear. And it's this grounding sequence from 0 to 1 that he captures, among other things, in his playful French pronouncement, "There is oneness," here written with an exclamation point, no doubt. What to make of this exclamation? Well, first, I would suggest that you break this phrase into two parts. First, there is, and second, oneness. There is the 0 point, the origin, the catalytic figure of the number 1 we can use to represent oneness. What, then, is the status of this 0 being made to count as the first number, the proper 1, if you will, in the sequence from 1 to 2 to 3 and so on, meta conditions? On page 115, Lacan defines it as a presupposition that cannot be deduced. Did you find that helpful? I didn't find that helpful. We didn't get a lot of fucking help there. He also, however, uses the word backdrop to describe this 0 point. There is, as a 0 point, as a backdrop against which oneness is proclaimed, can be proclaimed. He then doubles down on this backdrop imagery on pages 116 and 117 in some passages that I think are pretty damn revealing. We're here at the end of chapter 9, seminar 19, bottom of page 116. Existence is initiated straight away, is stated through its correlative in existence. There is no existence except against the backdrop of inexistence. And inversely, existere only derives its support from an out there that is not. It is indeed here that we have what is at issue in the one. And if you read down a little bit further toward the end, as he works up to the union again, which we will not be discussing, if only because I don't entirely find it useful in making these materials clear, coherent, and accessible, not yet at least. Notice his use of the Greek ekstan here. That's one for you to follow up on and see what you can make of. For our purposes, notice again how he's using in existence to talk this through. And again with the imagery of a backdrop, which is going to prove relevant for our purposes. Throughout all this, and you've read the chapters, you know this, Lacan's been flirting with set theory, promising his audience that he'll get there. But he never quite gets there in these materials. In chapter 9, we see him get waylaid with Frege and his own earlier work on inexistence, which we just capped off. At the start of chapter 10 in Seminar 19, it's the discourse of the analyst once more that he draws on for illustrative purposes, and again with an eye toward the one. Where in the discourse of the analyst, setting aside the matter of set theory that he keeps promising for just a moment, do we see the number one? Why, in the lower right-hand quadrant, in that S1, the S1 of the analysan's symptomatic expressions, of course. How are we to read these symptomatic expressions? Well, as you know, we read them as commandments of unconscious truths that cannot be presented in any other way, except as symptoms. In this sense, and it almost goes without saying at this point, as you can tell in the tone of my voice, after everything we've learned from seminars 17 and 18 in particular, the symptom here is a statement of the impossible, which is to say a name of the real, not unlike the masculine fantasy of an exceptional real man. Or as Lacan goes on to quip in what is by far my favorite moment so far in these materials, not unlike the unicorn. Oh, the animals. 17 has tons of great stuff on animals, on beavers, on plants, and the like. Here, it's horses and unicorns. Notice how he sets up the ladder. Notice how he arrives at the unicorn at the bottom of pages 121, top of page 122, and all by way of the analytic discourse. Check this out. The analytic discourse is designed to remind us that the real I've been speaking about is accessed via the symbolic. We access this real in and through the impossible that is defined only by the symbolic. Now that is a terrific, clear statement from Lacan on how he understands the real at this point in his thought. The real is only to be accessed in and through the symbolic as statements of what is impossible within the field of the symbolic. That's how we access the real, is at the level of its name, in the pronouncement of what we've been calling real discourse, which is always a discourse on and about impossibility. Here he is, coughing up that relationship that we've been working so hard to theorize. And then he's back to the ancients. I'm coming back to this at the level of Pliny's natural history. I don't see what differentiates the unicorn from any other animal that is perfectly existent in the natural order. The perspective that examines the real in a certain direction compels us to state matters in this way. I believe it's precisely here, with the addition of the unicorn of all figures, that Lacan finally begins to turn toward the aspects of set theory that he claims here will help us account for those two antagonistic backward E formulas, his first two formulas of the four of sexuation. And I believe with this unicorn we can account for quite a bit more. Let me ask you, what really is the difference between a horse and a unicorn? And don't you fucking say a horn. Don't you say some sort of spiral thing growing out of the forehead and a long out. No. It's simpler than that. One exists and the other does not. It's easy to count horses. one at a time, one by one single individual, one horse right after the other. But try counting unicorns. There aren't any around for us to count. There are 0 unicorns in existence. And I hate to shatter your dreams, my friends, let me just be pointed and I'm sorry, unicorns don't exist. Their existence is, hear me, impossible. And yet here we are, talking all about unicorns, following Lacan's lead. In reality, so to speak, there are 0 unicorns. But in the symbolic, at the level of the name of this impossibility, there are fucking herds of them. In reality, there exists at least one horse. They're not extinct. And you know there are millions more. But there does not exist at least one unicorn. Not one single unicorn exists. The logic, again, is digital. We use the number 1 to assign horses because they exist. We use the number 0 for unicorns because they do not. Horses are present and signaled by the number 1. Unicorns are absent and thus signaled by 0 because there aren't any of them. But as you know, the Lacanian real has little to do with reality as we usually experience it. As accessed via the symbolic, in the form of an impossibility named, discussed, dreamed about, unicorns are real. Horses are ones in reality, easily observed, tallied, collectivized, and the like. But unicorns are what Lacan calls, in our second radicalization of this expression, real ones. It's a terrific coinage that he's working with here. The unicorn is a real one. I'm speaking about the one as real, he reminds his audience. A real that may equally have nothing to do with any reality whatsoever. If you've got ears to hear, this is what's at stake in the confrontation between masculine fantasy and feminine truth in Lacan's 2 backwards capital E formulations. Men believe that the exceptional man is a horse, running free and wild, dick-slapping, flapping in the breeze without constraint, thoroughly, wholly self-sufficient and autonomous. It's hard to buy a pickup truck or an SUV without encountering the image of a horse with its mane flowing in the breeze. Women, however, show that this exceptional man is in fact a unicorn, a 0 made to count as 1, but only in the field of masculine fantasy. What intrigues Lacan in all of this talk, I believe, this talk of horses and unicorns, individual ones in so-called actuality and real ones in statements of impossibility, what Lacan is intrigued by in all of this is the interval between them. Read page 121, you'll see what I mean. And you know the algebraic symbol that we have for intervals of this sort, differential relations between any 2 entities or events. As an algebraic symbol in Lacanian psychoanalysis, object a does this work for us. It's an index, as you know, of the minimum irreducible distance or difference, the interval between any 2 entities or events that allows them to appear distinct. Here, horses and unicorns. Now, in previous lectures, when we were developing this definition, I often held up a pen to illustrate objet A. And here, if you're watching the video, I once more hold up a pen. I could have chosen another phallus, but you know what? The pen is what's handy to me. What's brilliant is that this is a pink one. We use the pen to illustrate objet as the minimum irreducible difference between this pen in your foreground and the wall in the pen's background. And I often summed this up with some fuzzy Lacanian math that still holds. 1 plus 1 equals 3. Because you have the pen in the foreground, the wall in the background, and the minimum irreducible difference or distance between the pen and that wall that allows the pen to emerge and appear distinct from the wall behind it. If you were to subtract that distance or difference between the pen and the wall, you wouldn't see either. You need to have that third element, the differential relation, in order for the other two to appear. 1 plus 1, for this reason, always equals 3. Because in order to have two distinct ones, they must be a differential relation between them. Otherwise, you would just have one. A topic we'll come to here in a moment. What I want to say, though, is that what Lacan's doing here in Seminar 19 is revamping this same math. The logic still applies, but the math is being revamped. 1 horse plus 0 unicorns still equals 3. 3 elements. There's a 1 in reality, the horse, a 0 made to count as a real one, the unicorn, and then there's the interval between these two. Here is your objet as interval. Why does all this matter? Why the fuck am I dipping into old stuff and talking about horses and unicorns and pink pens? Because it shows, I believe, that Lacan is thinking his way toward a very simple argument, and yet so simple that it also serves as the basis for some of the most complicated, sophisticated, profound, and truthful thought to occur since Lacan, as you've heard me say in the past. Lacan, though, thinks that what he's working up is just a simple Platonic argument. The one, oneness, never exists alone, and for this reason alone, it cannot exist. This is the argument that he's working up. The one, oneness, singularity, never exists alone. There's no such thing as a monad on its own. And for this reason alone, these images of oneness can only ever be that, images in an imaginarium. Check out page 123. It's pretty helpful in this regard. What will we be able to make of this, Lacan asks. The first thing that Plato sets down by way of objection is that this one will not be anywhere. Because if it were somewhere, it would be in an envelope, in a limit. And this is quite in contradiction with the existence of one. So also, I would add, with this exceptional real man of masculine fantasy, if he were to exist, he would have to exist somewhere, and thus be circumscribed, and thus be limited, and thus be castrated, and thus be subject to the very function that men believe he negates, the phallic function. In other words, if the exceptional man, the real man, were to exist, he could only ever be one more man in the set of all men, not an exceptional one man who eludes its enveloping effects. Time is short. Let's sum this up. First point, any one, a horse, a pen, a man, can only appear in the foreground for us to count against the background of a surrounding environment that it is not. In order for it to appear as one, it must be against the background that it is not, and thus in a differential relation with something else, and thus not alone. Second point, this difference between one and not, foreground and background, is itself an element to be counted as well. In order to count to 1, hear me now, you have to be able to count at least to 3. And as we're about to see, 4 is in fact the proper number. Let me see if we can be even more expansive here, even at the risk of sticking our necks out a little bit. Oneness for Lacan is founded on multiplicity. Its identity as the one is premised on differential relations that structure multiplicity, not the fantasy of self-sameness, self-sufficiency, independence, and autonomy that men sustain. And now you know the figure I had in mind when I said that this simple argument that Lacan claims to derive from Plato is the basis for some of the best anyone's done with his thought since the work of Alain Badiou, is founded on this basic Lacanian insight. Oneness is a production. Oneness is an effect. The foundation of oneness is, in fact, multiplicity. But don't take my word for it. Let's see how Lacan puts it on page 125. The one cannot be grounded on sameness. On the contrary, it has been marked out by set theory as having to be grounded on pure and simple difference. It's that pure and simple difference that serves as the foundational grounding of oneness, of sameness, of identity that Lacan has his eye on. And it's this that he thinks set theory can help us understand. I would also add that it's precisely this that, according to Lacan, we need to pay careful attention to set theory in order to understand. Check out what he does just a few paragraphs before on page 124. From the moment it becomes a matter of grounding it, the status of the one can only start off from its ambiguity, namely, that the mainspring of set theory hinges entirely on how the one that there is of the set is distinct from the one of the element. And here we start getting back into another logic that Lacan has presented us with before, also using set theory, that of container and thing contained, which we're about to dip into. But first, let's come up with another bumper sticker, if we can. Sameness, oneness, singularity without limit. All are productions, effects, formations of the real truths of difference, multiplicity, and ambiguity. Now, that may be longer than any bumper sticker you want to put on the back of your Honda Civic, but there you have it. I think this is yet another way to read Lacan's refrain, his exclamation in these middle chapters. There is oneness. The there is part of there is oneness. This is our background. This is the surroundings, the envelope, the container, or the set, if you will, for the oneness in there is oneness. Oneness is an element in this set, a thing contained by this container, this envelope, as Lacan calls it. This container and thing contained is what we're focused on here. And the difference between this container and thing contained, this set and element, is also itself an element to be considered and included as well. Once more, 1 + 1 = 3. In order for there to be oneness, and here I guess we need yet another bumper sticker, there must first be thirdness. In order for there to be one, there must first be 3. Only where 3 or more have gathered, you might think of it this way, can there be, in fact, 1. 1 + 1 = 3. But this multiplicity must also be repressed, forgotten, obscured, fantasized away. That is the destiny of the multiple. In order for the one to exist, even if only as a name of the impossible, these other ones, namely the background and the differential relation, or the container and the logic of containment, these other ones must be missing, lacking, lost, and forgotten. And not just absent here, but also crucially marked as such, with a figure of absence, with a signifier of lack, a noticeable, nameable loss. This indeed is how Lacan ends chapter 10 in Seminar 19. And with this ending, I think, he presents us with a new theory and attendant image of oneness. Join me on page 127. On the basis of what is involved, in the place where a whole is made, in this something that, if you want a figuration, I would represent as being the foundation of there is oneness. There can only be oneness in the figure of a bag, which is a bag with a hole in it. Nothing is one that doesn't come out of this bag, or which does not go back into the bag. This is the original grounding, to take it intuitively, of the one. The one, in other words, is not a monad, you heard me say, much less an ideal, exceptional existent, whether it's a horse, a pen, or a man. You know what it is instead? It's a fucking bag with a hole in it. That's what the one is for Lacan. It is a bag with a hole in it, a leaky vessel, a container whose contents, not all of them, can always be leaking out through the bottom. Now, in Lacanian psychoanalysis, you know we have several smart and interesting ways to talk about these visible holes, gaps, cracks, furrows, holes, and openings in bags, this bag of oneness. Interestingly, none of them come up here at the end of chapter 10. Instead, Lacan makes good on his promise and turns back to set theory and what he believes to be among its most relevant concepts, the empty set. Now, this is the first time he's resorted to the empty set. Check out, for instance, the final lecture in our series on Seminar 16, which follows closely the final chapters of Seminar 16, where again the topic of the empty set is on display. But notice how he pursues the topic here in chapter 10 of Seminar 19, especially on page 126. I think you're going to like this. The one begins on the level at which there is one missing. There's that hole in the bag. The empty set is therefore strictly legitimized in that it is, so to speak, the gate that has to be gone through in order to constitute the birth of the one. This is the first one that is designated through an admissible experience. I mean mathematically admissible, in a way that can be taught, because that is what matheme means. Remember, from the Greek, matheme means that which can be taught. And not one that appeals to any kind of coarse figuration. What constitutes the one and very precisely justifies it, which is designated only as distinct and not through any other qualificative ascertainment. Look at this boy with his $20 words. Is that it only begins with a $5 word, namely lack. You can read it for yourself on page 126. It's good shit. The hole in the bag of oneness. This is the stake for us. What is it? It's a zero turned one. It's a lack signal. It's a void traced. It's a discernible site of absence, where nothing appears, named, and thus presentified, as in fact something. So also with the empty set, which according to Lacan is anything but a coarse figuration. The empty set, and there can be only one for reasons we've discussed, notably at the end of our series on Seminar 16. The empty set is a zero that always counts as one, as an additional one, and sometimes often feels like a one too many in any given set. And in this sense, the empty set is a necessary logical subset of each and every set. After Cantor, we can't help but include it. And apologies in advance for this quick and dirty, fucked up little introduction to set theory, but I want you to catch up with Lacan on this point. This is, I believe, what he's doing with the empty set. Why is this the case? Why is the empty set necessarily a subset of any given set? And you'll see in a moment why this matters for us. Because set theory shows that if all the members or elements of any given set are also included in another set, this first set is a subset of the second. So take an example. Last time we talked about set theory in this way, I was talking about my cats. Let's think about dogs this time. Think about dogs. Imagine the set of all dogs, a container, a category, a classification, the title of which is all dogs. If it's a dog, it goes in this box. Imagine the set of all dogs. Now imagine the set of all black dogs. Because I got a black dog, I got to represent, same way I got a black cat, got to represent there too. The set of all black dogs versus the set of all dogs, it's not an opposition. It's one of subset and overarching set. Why? Because all black dogs are also included in the set of all dogs, this is why black dogs is a subset of all dogs. You just think about this stuff and it starts to make sense. The set of all dogs must include as a subset black dogs because all black dogs included in the set known as black dogs are also included in the set of all dogs, which thus makes black dogs a subset. The same, weirdly enough, is true of the empty set, and this is what intrigues Lacan about it, I believe. Consider, for instance, the set of all dogs that are also cats. This set or collection is empty. Why? Because there's no such thing as a dog who's also a cat. This set has 0 members, 0 elements. And how many dogs that are also cats would you say are included in the set of all dogs that we were just considering? Guess what? The answer is also 0. So technically speaking, the contents of the set, all dogs that are also cats, are also and exactly included in the set of all dogs. Both of these sets have exactly 0 dogs that are also cats in them. In other words, the set of all dogs that are also cats is a necessary logical subset of all dogs, and one that is empty. The same is true of every example of the empty set that you can imagine. All the dogs that live on the moon, all the dogs that live in the ether, all the dogs that live in your head. All of these sets have 0 members, and thus they function as the empty set. And I say the empty set here because set theory also shows that any set with exactly the same contents as another set, without remainder, is in fact the other set, and vice versa. There are not 2 sets, there would in fact only be 1 in this logic of extensionality. Dogs that are cats, dogs on the moon, dogs in the ether, dogs in your head, these are all the same set. These are all the empty set, because in each case, their contents are exactly the same. All of these sets contain nothing. Their elements equal 0. So let's see, in the midst of all this, from horses and unicorns, men and women, to dogs and cats in your head, on the moon, in the ether, and beyond. Can we sum all this up for God's sake? I think so. Lacan's argument about the one in these middle chapters of Seminar 10 proceeds as follows. 1. In order for there to be one, a single, individual, independent horse, dog, pen, man, you name it. This one must exist somewhere, in an environment of some kind, an envelope, as Lacan says, by which he means a set or a container. In other words, everything in the world is always just that, in the world, and thus included in a set. All things are contained, which allows us to count to 3 once more. There's a foregrounded individual, a backgrounded environment, and a differential relation between. 1 plus 1 still equals 3. But there's also a 4th element that has to be counted as well. The count cannot just stop at 3 if we are indeed to arrive at the production of a 1. There is also this 4th element that must be counted in order for there to be 1, and the name of this 4th element is the empty set. If every set includes the empty set, the set in which 1 horse, 1 dog, or 1 man appears must also include the empty set. It is not an exceptional set. The container, hear me now, in which the 1 appears as a thing contained also contains something else. A something else that, if you look at it from one angle, amounts to nothing and functions in precisely that way. How then, how exactly does this empty set appear alongside the 1 in question here? Why, as a 0, of course. And this 0 is exactly the symbol that we use to write the empty set in set theory. I hold it up on the screen. You know what it looks like. It's a 0 or a circle with a slash through it. This is indeed one of the primary ways that we write the empty set in set theoretical formulations. Thus, all told, the final count, at least for now, is going to be 4. You gotta have 4 before you can begin any sequence with the number 1. It takes at least 4 elements for there to be 1. This is precisely why Lacan calls the empty set a gate that has to be gone through in order to constitute the birth of the 1. And even more directly, he calls it, as you heard, the entrance porthole. And by far my favorite characterization, which you also just heard, the empty set is a hole in a bag that, technically speaking, contains nothing, as nothing that nevertheless will become something, a 0 turned 1, in order for the 1 itself to emerge. All of which serves to remind us of Lacan's central conception of the 1. Here it is again. Oneness is an effect, a production of a complex multiplicity matched only by the unconscious, just like the S1 produced in the discourse of the analyst. It's a production, an effect. Oh, so much the worse for the homoerotic fantasy of the real man, sustained by masculine subjects. And so much the worse for masculinity itself. It fares no better. But there is always hope in failure. The phallic function is a failed function, ever prone to slip, stumble, and false start. But there is always hope there. Unfortunately, it winds up being for hope for more of the same, yet another reason to have faith in the existence of the exceptional man. But that's not the kind of hope I'm talking about here. I started this lecture by telling you that Lacan is focused on his first 2 formulas of sexuation, the ones with the capital backwards EX. And what he's saying is that they serve as barriers to each other. There's an antagonism or a confrontation between them. And what I added was that I think one of them comes out on top. One is more true. One formula is more true. And I think you have a sense of what that is, as far as I'm concerned. The first formula of feminine enjoyment that says there does not exist anyone for whom the phallic function is inoperative. I believe this has more truth value than the first formula of masculine subjectivity, which says there does exist someone for whom the phallic function is inoperative. Why does this matter, and what is the hope to be gained from this presumed victory of one formula over the other? Well, what we know is that that first formula of masculine subjectivity that says there exists someone for whom the phallic function is inoperative, this guarantees the existence of all men as castrated, all masculine enjoyment being according to the phallic function. This first formula of masculine subjectivity guarantees the second and renders it valid. As long as there exists someone for whom the phallic function is inoperative, this exception can prove the rule that all men are castrated. In other words, can prove and validate the second formula of masculine subjectivity. What happens then when you pull this plug? What happens when you undermine the first formula? By God, the second one falls apart as well. When the first formula of feminine sexuality confronts and contests the first formula of masculine sexuality, it undermines the basic definition that we have of all men, of the masculine subject as being wholly, 100% subject to the phallic function. Which brings us to the fourth formula, the formula for feminine enjoyment that says not all of her enjoyment is pegged to the phallic function. This fourth formula shows the masculine subject and gives them an opportunity to embrace the fact that they too are free and able to enjoy differently. Once you pull the plug of the father and the category of masculinity starts to fall apart, men now find themselves in a similarly liminal position relative to the phallic function, and maybe even just liminal enough for them to realize the fact that they are indeed feminine subjects, like all of us. What I want to suggest is that the fourth formula, which we have discussed the least in this discussion, that says not all of women's enjoyment is a serf to the phallic function, I want to suggest that by undermining the masculine fantasy of the exceptional man, there's a liberatory effect, where now previously categorized as masculine subjects can now find themselves enjoying more like women, not according to a logic that says y'all are castrated and have to enjoy the phallic function, but instead that says not all of your enjoyment need to remain limited to the phallic function. I'd like to suggest that if you want to start thinking toward a horizon here, and you want to start asking the big question of why Lacan is so hot on the real man, so to speak, it's because he thinks at some level that by undermining that logic, by showing that there is no such thing as this exceptional one, that in order to have one, you actually have to have four, and thus the categories are all muddied. There is no oneness in the world, except at the level of fantasy, except at the level of product. When Lacan is driving at that point again and again and again, showing that you have to count to four before you can arrive at one, all that amounts to him undermining the masculine fantasy of the exceptional man, and thus pulling the bottom out of the entire category of all men that, again, is propped up on the man that it does not include, the no man that is left out in order to guarantee the containment of all men. Once you cancel out that no man, suddenly the totalizing set of all men has a hole in the bottom of it. Do you hear me? It has a hole in the bottom of it. That bag becomes leaky. And that is exactly the position that I think Lacan would have subjects, masculine and feminine alike, eventually arrive at. Where most, who knows, or not all, or some, or a little bit, some portion of their enjoyment will be according to the phallic function, but not all of their enjoyment will be according to the phallic function. If you want a horizon to start imagining, I'd say start imagining that one, and let the dear old daddy pass into the earth.